rolling, hopefully. Um, so I'd like to start out with Greg, since he's here tonight. Let me do this real quick. Screen. Okay. So hopefully this works. Hopefully everybody watching online can hear everything. Uh, we're trying to get everything coordinated here. We'll do this real fast. Okay. So this is Greg Barenberg. He's our representative with Raymond James to do municipal financing. So he's here tonight to answer questions about different types of funding. So last week we had multiple questions. Um, can you tell us basically how just the basic municipal general obligation bonds work?
Yeah. And, well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to join the meeting and hope I can answer some questions and appreciate the chance to join this study session. But Andy, I'm happy to talk about general obligation bonds and some of the key points of how they're issued. And then we can also talk about USDA financing, state SRF loan program, and even the Rural Water Financing Agency financing option that now exists in Kansas. But if you'd like, I can start with a general obligation bond issue or a revenue bond issue issued directly by the city, explain how that works, and if that's a good starting point.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, cities and other issuers bonds in Kansas have the ability to issue general obligation bonds or even utility revenue bond um, for utility system improvements. And so if you're thinking about a water project, one of the first things that we would look at is the Kansas statutes and what financing options are available. And then we start identifying the pros and cons of those two options. And if you're issuing bonds directly, there's really two types. One is a general obligation bond. The other is a water revenue bond issue. And the key difference is that a water revenue bond issue is pledging solely and only the revenues of the water system. And so it's a much more limited revenue stream. We don't see revenue bonds issued as much as general obligation bonds, and I'll talk about those here in a second. But the revenue bond, since you're only pledging the water system revenues, you typically would have to set aside a reserve fund equal to about 10% of the bond issue. You would have interest rates that are about 0.5% higher than a general obligation bond, just because they're viewed as a more narrow revenue stream, more risky. Um, and then the cost of issuance can be slightly higher, the financing costs on a revenue bond issue. And probably 10 or 15 years ago, the Kansas statutes were modified to make it easier to finance utility projects with general obligation bonds. And a general obligation bond is viewed as less risky from a bond investor perspective. And so you get really the lowest interest rates of any type of bond you can issue directly would be in a general obligation bond. And it's because you're pledging any and all legally available funds of the city, including your ability to levy property taxes if necessary to repay the bonds. Doesn't mean you'd have to use property tax to repay the bond issue, but that's the backstop for a bond investor. And we have a lot of cities that will issue general obligation bonds for water system improvements and then use water system revenues or some other dedicated revenue stream, maybe a sales tax, to repay those bonds. So with that broader pledge, you don't have to have a reserve fund. Your interest rates are going to be about 0.5% lower than that revenue bond issue. And just to put it in perspective, we had a $5 million issue that we sold for a city in Kansas last week. And we had a 20-year repayment schedule at an average interest rate of about 4.72%. And that was a kind of a longer weighted financing, but that gives you an idea of the interest rates. So the process you go through from the city perspective to issue general obligation bonds is really kind of 3 steps if you think about it from your perspective. One, you authorize the project, and that gives you the statutory authority to issue the bonds. Then when you're ready to actually go through the sale process, which takes about 2 months to complete from beginning to end, the first step from the council perspective is you adopt what's called an authorizing resolution. And that just gives us permission and your bond attorney permission to start putting together the financing. Then we would come back to you about halfway through that 2-month process with the final interest rates, the final bond rating, the final repayment schedule. And if that's acceptable, then you would adopt a bond resolution that locks in the interest rates. And then the remaining time for the issuance process is really just taking care of the legal documents, getting Attorney General approval that we've done everything properly, and then closing the issue. On the day of closing, we turn over the bond certificates to investors and they pay the purchase price, and you would have the money in your project fund at that point to complete the financing.
Okay.
So, Andy, I'll stop there. Any questions about just the general obligation bond or revenue bonds that the city could issue directly?
So one basic question is, when you do a bond issuance like that, are we committed to the entire period, or is there early payoff, or can we pay it off early?
Yeah, good question. So general obligation bonds you can issue for up to 30 years. I think revenue bonds you can go out a little bit longer, but we would typically, and you don't have to have you could have a 20-year repayment schedule or 15, and typically we would build in a call feature or a prepayment feature that would allow you to start paying down the financing early. And usually we can set that prepayment feature somewhere between year 7 and year 10 without penalty. We can set it shorter, but sometimes if you set it like a 5-year call feature on a longer 20-year bond issue, then that starts to put upward pressure on the interest rates. But almost every situation, sometimes as aggressive as 7, definitely never longer than 10, you have the ability to start paying that down.
Okay. So the shorter the call, the higher the interest rate.
It depends upon market conditions. When we're putting together the bond issue, we'll work with our trading desk and see just how short can we make that call feature without starting to see the interest rates go up. I would say, it's almost always in that 7 to 10 year range. If we had a shorter call feature, you may want that flexibility, but you'd also want to know what's that doing to the interest rate.
So do you have any questions?
How do bonds impact our emergency borrowing power as a city in a loan?
I'm sorry, the question was related to your emergency borrowing power.
How does a bond issuance like that affect our borrowing power as a city if we have an emergency need borrow?
Okay. Yeah. So you want to be careful. Fortunately, the debt limits in Kansas are flexible enough that we don't have many cities that run into debt capacity limitation. But general obligation bonds do have a debt limit. But the good news is that there's a lot of exceptions to bond issues that don't count against that. So if you issue bonds for a utility system improvement, water or wastewater, those don't count against the debt limit. If you issue bonds, there's kind of some odd exceptions. If you finance street improvements, a portion of a street that's adjacent to a school district, that portion of the bond issue then doesn't count. The rest of it would. And so we do have, some cities that will issue the revenue bonds just to make sure that you don't have too much of your financing tied up in that general obligation bond format. And for example, the issue that I referenced, we sold a general obligation bond issue last week for the city of Wamego. But then we came back back yesterday, and we had an electric revenue bond issue that we also sold for WEGO, and we did that as a revenue bond issue just because we didn't want to tie up the general obligation bond capacity of the city. So sometimes you want to finance it through a different form of financing so that you preserve your ability to issue general obligation bonds, for example, for say some street projects or some other improvement in the city. But you have the statute has a debt limit for general obligation bonds. The other categories really don't have a debt limit. Public building commission bonds, utility revenue bonds really don't have a debt limit. That's one limit that you think about, but then you also think about bond investors. If you have too many projects financed all with general obligation bonds, then your debt ratios that those investors look at sometimes can start to get high. And they'll look at your debt as a percentage of assessed valuation or your debt per capita ratios. Did that answer your question?
Pretty much. This water project's going to be ongoing and going to require periodic financing. I just want to know where we're going to fall as far as safety. Our biggest concern is that we go with phase one, which we think probably is going to take care of a majority of our problems, according to JEO or engineering consultants. But if it doesn't, then we're still losing $140,000 a year, and we have to move forward with another portion of the project. And at some point, we're going to reach the maximum, not the maximum, but a level where we're not necessarily comfortable with what we have left in borrowing power. That's why I want to know.
Yeah, and so usually what we would do at the early stages when we start focusing in on how to finance a project, we'll want to know, is there a possibility that there's more financing for that, just as you mentioned, and then we can run the debt ratio calculations and see, okay, I'm making up numbers, but let's say the first phase is 3 million, and in an extreme situation, if you had to come back in and do a second phase, and maybe it's another 2 million, then is 5 million too much? And we can run the financing on the phase one, but we can also then show what it would look like if we had to go ahead and layer in a second financing, call it phase two, and all of a sudden you have 5 million in bonds outstanding. Does that become, we'd want to look at that not only on your ratios, but if you're wanting to pay that out of the water system, what does that do to user rates or debt service coverage ratio? And so we'll do some of those calculations for you up front before you commit into any, financing path. But it's always good to know that the possibility the project may not stop with phase one, and so we'd want to model what that second phase might look like.
And if I hear you correctly, if we do a water project and have to turn it into a street project, do those separate type of bond?
Yes, yeah, you could. In general obligation bonds will in all likelihood, aside, and we'll talk about the SRF program and USDA here in a second, but general obligation bonds, if you're issuing bonds directly, that's going to be your lowest cost form of financing. Right. But you want to be careful that you don't, tie up all of your borrowings in the general obligation bond, and then wake up one day and say, well, now we need to do street projects. How do we finance those? And really the only way to finance a street project would be general obligation bonds. So you don't want to tie up all your capacity and have a project where you really need to issue general obligation bonds, and all of a sudden, your things can become a little too tight. So it's always helpful to be thinking about how do you finance the project that you're focused on today, but what do you have on the horizon down the road, and how we would layer in those projects also.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, can we go to the Rural Water Financing Authority, since it's kind of along the same lines? or it
Yeah.
involves bonds also?
Yeah, the RWFA, or Rural Water Financing Agency, is a relatively new program in Kansas, but it's been around. It actually started in Kentucky. It has now authority to complete a financing in all 50 states. And the concept is the RWF, rather than the city issuing its bonds directly, the city would participate in a pooled financing. And for example, we have a pool that is selling on June 10th. We've got two borrowers from Kansas that are part of about 20 borrowers nationally that are, participating in financing that's going to be about 50, 60 million. And the benefit of going through the pooled financing program, the RWFA, is that the bond rating for the RWFA program is a AA minus rating, and getting the highest possible rating is AAA. Getting into that AA category of a rating is quite an accomplishment, and so a lot of cities aren't able to have a bond rating that high. You may be in the single A or the triple B level, and as you have a higher bond rating, then you get a more favorable interest rate. And then also, if you are one of 20 participants in a pooled financing, then you're paying for one bond rating instead of everybody paying for 20 separate bond ratings. And so some of those cost of issuance are shared. And so it can help on just being a cost effective approach. And then if you have a utility project, I had mentioned earlier, some of the forms of financing, you might have to set aside a 10% reserve fund. So let's say it's a $3 million project. Well, if you have to set aside 300,000, that can be a burden, and sometimes you have to borrow that extra 300,000. The RWFA program has a common reserve fund that everybody shares, so you don't have to fund your own reserve fund. It has a AA minus rating, and it has some of the efficiencies of being a pooled borrowing. The nice part about the program is that you can go in and tailor your financing to exactly the repayment schedule you need. We have one city that is participating, and they're doing $1 million project with a 10-year repayment, and that's actually City of Marion. And then we have a rural water district that's doing $1.25 million, and they're financing their project over 30 years. So you kind of set your repayment schedule up to a 30-year period, and the current interest rate, that 10-year financing will be about 4.07%, and a 30-year financing may be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 4.75%. The other thing to keep in mind is that the RWFA program doesn't require, the program itself doesn't force you to comply with Davis-Bacon prevailing wage or the Build America, Buy America provisions. And sometimes those federal provisions or requirements can drive up your project cost. So that's kind of the summary of the RWFA program. It's relatively new in Kansas, but they have completed 300 bond issues for over 500 million in total financing. So you can see there's been a lot of participants. It's a kind of a well-established program. It's just now being introduced into Kansas. Andy, I kind of view the RWFA program as almost an offset of issuing bonds directly. We would just ask the question of, are you better off issuing your bonds directly or issuing your bonds through that RWFA program, and kind of look at the comparison side by side.
So and then back to the early payoff, is there any early payoff option on that?
Yeah, this current round, and I think most of the rounds end up with a 9-year call feature without penalty. So again, kind of in that 7 to 10 year range, just the RWFA program has set their call feature at 9 years. And that's, you can call or prepay in whole or in part. So in $5,000 increments, if you had built up 200,000 in fund balance and wanted to use half of that to start paying down bonds, you would just redeem 100,000 of bonds without penalty.
So, what, maybe we talked about it on the general obligation bond, but what's the standard rate? Or what is the latest common rate, interest rate on the general obligation?
Yeah, if you had a 20-year financing today, and we had a little bit of improvement in the bond market today, you'd probably be borrowing in that 4.5 to 4.7% range.
Yeah.
If you had a 10-year financing, shorter repayment schedule currently gets you a little bit lower interest rate. You're probably in the 4 to 4.2% range.
Okay, so it's very similar rates, it's just different
Yeah.
methods. Okay.
Yeah, and again, that's assuming that you get a favorable bond rating. To get those rates, you'd have to apply for a direct bond rating from the city, and I don't know that you've done that in the past. But typically, you would go to Moody's or Standard & Poor's, request a bond rating, and that cost of the bond rating is somewhere in the neighborhood of probably $20,000, $15,000 to $20,000 would be the cost of the bond rating.
Excuse me, questions on that? We go to the USDA.
Yeah, so the USDA and the SRF are kind of different programs than issuing your bonds directly. And USDA is a very good financing program. It does require, Andy, you may be more familiar with this than me, but I do believe on a project that you would undertake through the USDA, they would require that you comply with some of those federal requirements like Build America, Buy America, Davis-Bacon. And you'd want to talk to your engineer and see if that has any impact on project costs if you're going that financing direction. But the USDA program works a little bit differently. Think of it as a construction financing and then a long-term permanent financing. And so the USDA, their financing program, they allow you to borrow for up to 40-year period. And so very long repayment schedule. Interestingly enough, some of the cities I work with will say, okay, even though the interest rate is better than we can get on other forms, I don't want to be paying for this for 40 years. So sometimes that 40-year repayment schedule can be favorable, and other times you look at that and say, well, even though it's a longer period at low interest rate, I'm incurring a lot more interest expense just because it's stretched out over a longer period of time. But and you can prepay under the USDA financing program, so keep that in mind as well.
For early payoff.
Yeah, for early payoff, exactly. Okay. And what's really unique about the USDA approach is that they won't provide construction financing. So let's say you have a 2-year construction project, and the city would go out and issue its own temporary notes. And temporary notes can be issued in Kansas for up to 4 years. They're actually a form of general obligation financing, but they're intended for like short-term construction, just like this. And so the city would issue its own temporary notes, say for $3 million. You then take the proceeds, construct the project. Interest during construction will be paid out of the financing proceeds. So you're not really paying interest until the project's done, or paying any debt service until the project's done. Then let's say at the end of that 2-year period, the construction is complete, you turn to the USDA and say, okay, we've completed construction, we're ready to roll our financing, these temporary notes into a long-term 40-year USDA loan. And that's when the USDA will issue its loan proceeds. You then take that money, pay off those temporary notes, and then you start making payments after construction. Your first debt service payment will be to the USDA under that loan agreement. So at the very beginning of all of that process, the USDA will issue what's called a letter of conditions. And that letter of conditions will basically spell out to the city that, all of the things you have to comply with And it's a fairly long list. Not that they're onerous or difficult to comply with. It's just you have to comply with all of them. And if you do, then the USDA has committed already that they will pay off those temporary notes and roll it into that long-term permanent financing. So, some of the things that they require, they'll require, environmental assessment, sometimes a cultural resource study. They want to make sure that you don't, before you sign that letter of condition, that you haven't done any work on the site. So they're very strict on some of those requirements at the early stage. And then once you have that letter of condition, you issue your temporary notes, complete the project, you prove to the USDA that you complied with all of those conditions, and then they roll that short-term financing into a long-term permanent financing for you. I didn't look up the current USDA rates, but I believe it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 3.5% to 4.25% for a 40-year financing. So it's a longer term than any of the other options that I talked to you about, and it's a little bit lower interest rate. So again, the interest rate can be very favorable. Kind of the big question you ask yourself up front, and really for the engineer, is if you go down this path, does that $3.3 million project now become 3.3 billion or 3.5 billion or some other number, because there might be an impact on the construction budget because of some of the USDA federal requirements.
So even though the interest rate's a little lower, the cost of the project may be higher because of compliance issues.
Yeah, and I don't want to represent that it always would drive up the project cost. It's just, that's one of the key questions you want to ask up front. And for what it's worth, I work with the Chisholm Creek Utility Authority, so Park City and Bel Air. And we looked at the SRF program relative to just issuing bonds directly. And in that situation, we had, I think it was $20 million project cost for the authority to issue its own. If it issued its own bonds directly, then the project cost was going to be $20 million. And I think it was 23 or 24 million was going to be the cost if we went through the SRF program. So those requirements were having an impact on their project, where it was pushing up some of the project costs. And again, I'm not suggesting that's always going to be the case, but it's really a question you want to ask pretty early in the process before you commit to any of these financing options. So we complete a lot of short-term financings for the USDA program, and I really do like it as a financing option. And especially if you have a project that's a significant project for the city and really want to stretch out that repayment schedule, then USDA offers about the longest low interest rate financing of any of these programs.
So on the state revolving fund, they have requirements too.
Yes, that's what we found. And again, it was really the engineer looking at the requirements and making the calculation of what it would be the impact on the project. But that Chisholm Creek Utility Authority, they were looking at the state revolving loan fund, or SRF program in Kansas, and comparing that financing option to issuing bonds directly. So again, USDA and the SRF program, you kind of want to ask that question about Davis-Bacon and Build America, Buy America, and any other provisions that might impact your project cost.
And then also the state revolving loan fund, that is funded through the EPA. Is it? I mean,
yeah, the way there's a federal grant that is given to each of the states, and then the states decide how they best leverage that federal money. And so the states have gone, in many of the states have gone out and borrowed their own local match or state match to that federal match, then create a revolving loan fund from that pile of money, if you will. And so that's where some of the federal requirements come in, because some of the SRF programs are actually leveraging the federal dollars, and the federal government says, if you're using this money to make loans, then here are the requirements that go along with that.
And then the state revolving loan fund also, there's the ability for early payoff.
There is the ability for the early payoff, and on there's two different revolving loan funds in Kansas. One is for wastewater, the other is for drinking water. And the interest rate subsidy on the wastewater or sewer projects is more than what you're seeing on the drinking water side. And so, and again, I don't have the exact rates, but I would guess that the current wastewater sewer type revolving loan financing may have a rate of maybe 2.5%. So very, very low interest rate. Probably the lowest interest rate you could have for utility financing would be a wastewater project through the state revolving fund program. The water subsidy on the interest rate, it isn't quite as much. I would guess it's probably in the neighborhood of 3.5 to 3.75% rate for a water state revolving loan borrowing. I'd also want to check. I know at one point there was a limitation, I believe, of 20-year repayment schedule, and I don't know if that has been extended or you can consider something a little bit longer. But I would say I was at a recent conference where I heard a speaker from KDHE talking about the water SRF program, and the gentleman made a comment that they have a lot of applications, and for many of the recent years, they had more money than they had loan demand, but now that has kind of flipped to where their loan demand is so strong that they're concerned that over the course of these next 2 or 3 years, that they may have more applications than they have money to allocate. So that's something else that either we could help you explore, you could call KDHE directly, or I'm sure the engineer can get that information. But before you would commit to going down that path, you'd want to know what the likelihood of being approved and getting funding through that water SRF program would be, especially if there's a lot of competition.
Right.
But you can see that both the state and the federal programs, you end up with a very good interest rate. You have kind of some repayment periods between 20 and 40 years. You have the ability to prepay it, maybe even more flexibility to prepay it. I think on these programs, you can even prepay in the earliest years, before years 7 and 10. But one of the key things is to explore impact on project cost in those situations.
So we do have, I believe our wastewater or lagoon loan is through the wastewater side of state revolving loan fund.
Okay. Yeah, if you can get approved, I mean, it's hard to beat that. And it's such an attractive interest rate. It's really the best financing option for a project like that.
Mm. Did you have any other questions on financing options? Okay, I think that's all we've got. Oh, Mike's got one.
Sorry about that. Do you have much experience or any experience with I'll call it privately owned banks, for instance, the cooperatives in the United States, Electric, Telco, those kinds of things, all own a bank called NRUCFC, National Rural Utilities Finance Corp. Have you ever had any experience with any of those?
Usually, I'm familiar with them in very general terms, but usually, I'm in the public finance department or debt investment banking department of Raymond James, and usually an entity that's borrowing through one of those programs really doesn't need us involved, so we kind of see it from an outsider perspective. But I think some of those co-op programs are pretty limited in terms of the scope of the type of projects that they would consider financing. For example, I know there's some electric, um, you know, electric co-op financing options, but they'll only finance an electric project. Is that what you're referring to?
That was my question, was if you had any experience with that was.
Yeah, I can help you explore them, but you really don't need us. If there's a financing option there, you really don't need us to help. That they would help coordinate your financing. But a lot of the projects that we get involved in are water or wastewater or street or city hall type projects. Some of the electric co-op projects they don't even issue tax exempt municipal bonds, which is really our focus.
Then what are the restrictions for the city borrowing money, or the limitations? I mean, we have to go through either some kind of state or federal program or bond issuance of some kind. I mean, we can't just go out and borrow money, right?
Correct. Yeah, the way the Kansas statutes, the mechanism where you can borrow money is through the issuance of bonds or temporary notes. Now, when you participate in like the Rural Water Financing Agency program, you're technically issuing a bond to the RWFA, kind of the same thing with USDA. I call it a USDA loan, but USDA is really buying your bonds. So the question that comes up often is, well, why can't we just go down to the bank and take out a loan? And it's because the Kansas statutes don't allow you to do that. You can issue bonds and we could place them directly with the bank, and that's on general obligation bonds. That's a way that to sell those bonds is through a direct placement. But you can't just enter into a loan. The one other exception is that there are lease financing statutes where you can do a lease purchase type of a financing, but that's typically used for shorter term, smaller amounts, maybe more equipment financing than like a street or a utility type project.
We just did a lease project with our fire truck.
Yeah, that's fire truck's a perfect example. We see lease financing for those all the time. And you may take out a 5 or a 10-year lease as opposed to doing a 20-year bond issue or something like that.
All right. Well, if you don't have any other questions, thank you for your time, and we'll
Sure.
try to plot out which direction we're going to go.
Okay, well, I hope it was helpful. I hope I didn't take up too much of your time, but I hope that does help clarify some of the financing options that are available. So thanks for letting me join you this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
It's a juggle. Maybe. Okay. Well, that was the discussion on how all the financing works. I guess we can pay off bonds early, which is a good thing. There might be a little more interest rate if we do factor in that early call feature, but the general obligation bonds are the easiest. Just a matter of doing it. So there's not a ton of paperwork or a ton of process. Yeah. So I asked our bond counsel how that worked, and basically they said they give us step-by-step instructions and resolutions and all of everything. They just walk through the process. I think it was like maybe 90 days. So pretty quick turnaround on, but and it didn't sound like it did have a higher interest rate, but it didn't sound like it was a whole lot higher. but on $3 million, not a whole lot higher, it's still
A lot
a
of.
lot of money. Yeah. Um, so we talked about whittling and not whittling so much.
My sign.
What's that?
I'm looking for my whittling sign up there.
Whittle no more.
Right, a little bit more.
Yeah, let me pull up, see if I can pull up that real quick here. Yeah. So again, this year we are whittling, and we're cutting and cutting just so that we have cash in the bank. And we're just to restate, we're short, or will be short at the end of the year if we don't whittle, because tax revenue did not come in like we anticipated last year. We figured out that both we got hit with a reduction and Benton got hit with a reduction, because there was pending property exemption that I didn't realize was out there. Why they don't just factor in that exemption when they send us our mill amounts, I don't know. But so we had in our town, we had the elementary school expansion, and they had about $5.75 million that was put onto the property valuation, so our property valuation went up by that much. But it was going to be exempted, and they didn't exempt it until after we had passed our budget. So that cut us out about $25,000, but still there's a little more factored in that property or motor vehicle tax didn't come in like we had anticipated. I think Benton, I mean, I don't know exactly, but I think Benton got hit for close to 100,000. But they got a whole new school. So and that, I mean, that was a chunk for them, but a chunk for us too. But so we've got to factor that in. We won't know. I think looking at by about June 15th, maybe next week, week after, we'll know our valuation rates. We'll know what our mill levy is, and we'll know if there's pending exemption out there. If there is, I'll call the county clerk's office and say, okay, is this going to happen? We need to factor this in. So,
I suppose at that point you can get a rough idea to what the percentage of property taxes we're actually paying this year. Probably 10% short, 20% short.
right, so we'll have our second tax payment coming in
Right.
in June, so we'll have a better idea as to where we stand. Right. Right. So there are a lot of things that we need to plan for in the future, and my proposal is that we factor in an amount for capital improvement, street repair, and that kind of thing for 2026. And that is just general put in the bank money like we've always done, just put money in the bank. And then this summer, probably next month, we start on our capital improvement plan. And in that plan, Matt, when he was here, he put together a capital improvement plan, and I think that was like in 2020. I'll have it, that capital, oh, you had to put it out there. I'll get that to all of you before the council meeting. Actually, I did send it out to you this morning, but that's a good start. To see what we have been looking at. But in the new capital improvement plan, what we need to do is factor in that survey of streets. We need to survey all of our equipment to see what condition. When we factor, or when we figure they're gonna not be fixable anymore. You know, our skid steer was having issues. It still works, but it doesn't work like it should. We need to do a survey of all our buildings, the roofs, the heating and air conditioning units. You know, on this building, the heating and air conditioning unit is working, but last year it was making noise. So,
That got hot.
right, right.
Hot.
We need to do a survey of our sewer system. And our lagoon is I think a 30-year lagoon, and we are at year 16. Yeah. So we need to kind of plan ahead for how to tackle that. What do we need to do to expand the lagoon? And then if the development happens down here, do we need to expand the lagoon? So that's just things that need to be factored into that capital improvement plan. We need to do a survey of our parks and figure out what we need to do with that. Probably need to come up with a master plan for that, or what we're gonna do with the parks. Kind of come up with some kind of direction. Another thing that's not a part of the capital improvement plan, you'd think it would be, but, we really need this massive amount of water that we had, yesterday was perfect proof that we need to do some engineered plan to upgrade our drainage system. We've got ends of town, like the south end of town catches all the water. And some of the ditches have been eroded out. Now we've got a ditch that comes across from, 8th Street, carrying all that water out down from 8th Street across to 7th Street, and that's getting eroded out. And all these places have been chronic issues from the time the town had started. So,
But only when it rains.
yeah, but only when it rains.
And that's the problem.
Right,
When it's hot, the ground spreads, the wax break.
right.
Yeah, I'd like to see, I mean, this, I talked about this with Matt 5 years ago. $20,000-$30,000 in budget transfers doesn't go a long way when you're replacing a $200,000 equipment.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah,
And try to get Ernie to work with the schedule of, okay, in the real world, this is gonna have to be replaced in 10 years. There's a cost of variance factor for inflation, this is what it's gonna cost us. Face facts, we don't pay for it. We pay for it incrementally, or we pay for it after the fact. And those are the kinds of things that we can look at.
and you know, even a piece of equipment like our agenda that we just bought, which works great.
Yeah.
You know, if we have to, if it's too big, just buy outright, and we know that this thing's gonna die on us, or a piece of equipment's gonna die on us the next 5 years, at least we can put money down to knock down that. amount.
Paying for the service, it's starting to need to be replaced,
Yeah.
quite honestly. It's just when, what's the cost? Because it ain't.
Well, that's the mind change that we're doing right now is that wouldn't
Yeah,
really happen for
Yeah. Well-
whatever years.
who knows why?
So, well,
We've asked for it every year.
it doesn't matter why.
Yeah.
Now we can move forward. We have council who can do that.
But that's what I'd like to see is,
You know, how do we get to that point to where
So,
we have the money to build to those things in the future?
right, so with our capital improvement plan, once we get that lined out, in our financial statements, like our balance sheet, I can create like under equipment fund, we can create each item like, skid steer, backhoe, whatever.
Yeah.
And you can see what's been put into each fund.
right, yeah, that's,
Yeah,
that's,
We seem to know how to make our money stretch without whittling. how to make our money stretch to fill those obligations, so we're not.
Right.
So plan for,
And,
plan for,
Correct.
not just right.
Right.
Well, there's little stuff, and even the little stuff, somebody, if Ryland says, hey, you know, $7,000 more, or whatever it is beginning to give us some problems. We get a couple more years out of it. We need to buy, right? We need to put some money also into an emergency corporate reserve fund or something like where we
Right.
got
well,
$20,000 sitting there, the boom, or blows up, we're not out here with weed eaters trying to.
or perfect example is the bucket truck that we got. It's
Yeah.
a great deal. I mean, they made us a fantastic deal on it, but the minute we got it, the DEP system crashed on it.
Yeah.
That was $11,000.
Stuff happens.
Yeah.
We got, you know,
We got to plan that stuff when it happens. It doesn't kill us. It doesn't hit us with the fall back. Make us think, oh crap, now what do we got to cut out? So,
Same thing as every citizen of the city, you know, they all have some kind of budget,
yeah,
and some kind of emergency plan, whatever that may be.
maybe $5, maybe
That's right.
$500.
That's right.
We've got something.
Personal finance is the number one thing that they work on is you gotta have emergency.
That's right. And the city's no different. We got to,
We're just a whole bunch of personal finances lumped together.
that's right. $5.
Like, you were talking about this year's budget. Do you have a projection of what it's gonna take to fund the city for next year?
Yeah, and I'll have a better idea, since we've had this discussion, I'll have a better idea at the council meeting.
Okay, good.
But, right now, which thing,
I mean,
it's,
we've looked at that, but is that a realistic number?
yeah,
Okay,
yeah, so, last year we budgeted for 900,000. And we typically don't max that out, we
Right.
typically come in under.
nothing's typical.
Right, but because of cash and everything, cash shortage and things are tight, I'm anticipating that we're gonna spend, 833,000, so significantly less. Next year, I do have it budgeted still less, but I haven't factored in, an increase in putting money into, streets, equipment repairs, capital improvements.
And that's not whittling, correct?
There's some whittling in this factor. And that's what I'm saying is next council meeting, I'll have a better,
Handle on
in budget. So,
stuff to say. No more whittling? We can go in and plug in what we actually received this year after we get the secondary.
yes,
Plug
right.
it into next year, but just to look at,
right,
say if we're close to the same thing, this is the shortfall, this is the overage, how much more can we realistically put in for capital improvement,
right.
transfer funds, what, okay.
And, just to restate, I think I said this last week, but, street in Wichita with curb and gutters, to replace that street,
$1
$1 million. Same price here, $1 million. It's just that we don't have the population to
absorb it.
absorb it.
So that, just like the person, why would that plan more closely?
Agreed.
Figure out.
We got very good people here.
And also, we're looking at ways to increase revenue of the city.
Oh, man.
We have a new program with Vintage Bank, which is great. We know put another 15,000 in. Even the staff is trying to brainstorm how to come up with new ways to make money. One of them is tree trimming. We got the bucket truck. I don't know if our insurance company let us do that, but yeah,
Don't drop it on anybody's house.
yeah. And the other one was dog boarding. That's
I like it.
yeah.
Lady across the highway, she may not like it. So that those numbers are great that you're thinking about those things. But realistically, at 15,000 or whatever, we're really thinking about the future at that point, or are we thinking big enough? I don't know, I'm asking.
Well, and that's what our
So-
capital improvement plan will give us a
Yes.
best idea.
I was just talking about
I mean,
something from the average little piece of equipment.
yeah, no, like,
So that
I'm just,
going out and buying a $100,000 truck and paying cash
Right.
for it.
well, we have to be responsible, don't get me wrong. I
I mean,
understand that,
there's
but at the same
things,
time,
and there's things, there's a difference between wants and needs. I don't know.
100%. I agree.
Zig Ziglar always said, if you shoot at nothing, you're gonna hit it every time.
Every darn time.
So,
So we need to get a capital improvement plan, equipment. You gotta figure out how long a piece of equipment's gonna last, how much it's gonna cost to replace it. when it's
and then we'll have an idea.
expired. Add all that stuff together,
Factor for inflation.
put money back. With that whole plan as a goal.
And plug into each one of them.
Probably won't be able to finance it right away, but.
Agreed.
Because we're gonna pay for it now, pay for it.
I agree.
Might as well start paying.
I think I've seen. a
We don't wanna break
project like
anybody's
that.
back, but we don't wanna hit them with an emergency like
Yeah.
a water situation. I mean, it's a balance. Now, we heard for a number of years, council, and it was a lot of views. We heard from city maintenance for a number of years. All the sewers in great shape, all the water systems fine, this, that, and the other. And so,
Well, it is until it isn't.
well, yeah, and what we gotta figure out now is, it's probably isn't gonna be at some point. Set future councils up to the point where they're not dealing with emergencies like we are.
Right.
So,
So the whack-a-mole form of budgeting is not
I hate it.
Uh,
I don't like it.
I don't like it in the first.
I don't like it.
But like it. Yeah, in business.
Don't get me wrong, like I said, we have to be responsible, and there is a difference between need and wants, but golly, let's start thinking about the future of this town and get people in here, whatever that means. Whether it's businesses or new houses, when's the last time a house was built in Tawana? I think I heard somewhere 14 years.
Well, that's,
no,
you're
I was
full
still
of
on Main Street.
Oh, yeah. But before those, you're,
Well, where's the problem? Because we're kind of landlocked. There's not a lot of places to build with that.
I agree with you. But,
So,
you know,
I mean, we've got the area that fell about out Pool Road.
And I saw an auction sign on
Property.
the property around the back pine.
Um,
So that's, I don't know what I was gonna call. Yeah. I mean, I'm not gonna buy it, but
look at all
I
that.
mean, well, we made points of people in the direction to buy. it.
yeah,
Well,
and actually,
we all know.
yeah, it's the perfect direction to go.
I'm just saying, I mean, we have to start thinking about this thing, right? We have to think larger and how do we do these things? I don't know.
We don't start out setting precedents.
That's right. Everybody's
It's easier
for
for
what
somebody to
done.
follow up.
Like the amount of debt that we don't have, right? That's something to be proud of.
Yeah.
A lot of cities can say that. Cool. Okay, we can tilt that down. Now, let's figure out the next step in that process.
Also, with more people coming in, more people are gonna say, hey, we need this, and somebody say, I got the money, I can.
Yeah. So I think we're heading in the right direction. We just have to make a plan now.
I read the map, it doesn't be followed up.
Yeah.
What else?
That's,
I was, you sent out one today and I just had time to go by the house and print it out. Talking about this, what's the deal with Safe Streets? Is this
Oh.
a council meeting or is this?
that was just a
Just for
thinking
information.
point. Yeah,
Okay.
thinking point. Yeah, so we've got the Safe Street grant. But, they said we're good to go, but it's not for construction, it's just for studies. And, if we don't qualify for the state share program, we're gonna have to come up with $35,000 just to do the study. And I honestly think that KDOT can do the same thing, or some of the universities can do the same thing. it just kind of scares me getting into it because it's a federal grant, a lot of stipulations, a lot of, and since JEO helped us apply for it, that disqualifies them for, bidding on the project, which shoots all these little towns in the foot because they don't have an engineer staff on hand to do this. And I'm like said in the email, I looked at the application for this grant. I have no idea. It was like, what's the length of time for this project? I don't know. I don't know what the project is. How are you going to ensure, no, there was just a lot of things, and it's like, I have no idea. And if I fill this out, I'm just guessing. So it really favors, the bigger cities who can, they can have their own engineers fill out the thing and then,
Gotcha.
And that was, so I heard the numbers that you sent out the stuff about, obviously, yeah, when, they couldn't be, but. So we're looking at another 120 days, is that how I'm reading this?
yeah, so I talked with, our engineer, the lead engineer on our water system rebuilding design. And he said basically we're gonna have to they're gonna do 60 days to put it together, the topographical survey. How they do it, I don't know.
Drone.
Yeah, so, yeah. But then it will take about 60 more days to put together a plan. And once they get that put together, they'll do a virtual call with us and go from there. So we'll have a much better idea as to cost and scope and all of that, in about 4 months.
We really have a price range that we're talking about financing rather than something
Yeah. Mhm.
like we spend $25,000 to $30,000 on that. That's the kind of situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
But I mean, the figure I'm using or thinking about is like between 3 and 4 million.
Yeah. Well,
And
yeah,
that's-
but don't know, there's a lot of difference between 3 and 4.
Well, yeah.
So they're not planning on telling us anything for 4 months.
Yeah.
Are they gonna hold us financially responsible if their drone gets shot down?
Well, at least the shooter.
So
The shotgun.
we're at that point, we're a year since they brought their little sketch.
Yes.
This is the problem.
So I said it last week, I said it in the past. I understand things take time, but a year from scratch and dent to possibly something else. I think that's I think that's an issue. Maybe not. Maybe that's how it works.
It is, yeah, maybe, it seems to be that's how it works, but I'm not gonna. So what I can do is I can call, the engineer and say, can we speed this up?
Yeah, we've been asking a lot for a while. I mean, we asked them when they were here. And they're just kinda, I feel like, maybe not, I don't know the background of it, but I feel like they're just dragging their feet. And maybe there's a reason for it.
Well, part of it was, that I didn't realize they were wanting, an answer from me on that, on the plan that they proposed to us this last month. I didn't realize they were waiting on me to say, yes, go with that.
Well,
So that delayed it some, but we're still looking at 4 months.
I guess there's nothing we can do about it. It is what it is, but I think
Is
when they
is
get
this a
here,
typical performance package for them as far as
Yeah,
how long it takes to do things?
I don't know. I know they've done a lot of these water system designs.
I think that's something we need to make sure we bring up when they are here in
Yeah,
October.
I
There's nothing we can do about it now.
no,
we can sit and complain about it, but the fact is, as long as they're working, it's never gonna be fast enough for any of us or the people watching on these cameras. But as long as we get some kind of update, that'll
Right.
help us too.
And the benefit to us is that we didn't have to pay.
Not yet.
Right. Well, the money comes from the state water office.
Yeah, I can still check the land, right,
We're
but I don't
paying
like it.
$12,000.
I don't like it,
water.
but
So, that was paying in some respect.
Okay.
Well, we'll just see what,
You know, the other piece of that is they got the money and they walked through all that process.
Right.
If they hadn't done that, we would have to come up with $300,000. So I'm thankful that they
absolutely,
got that.
absolutely.
okay.
I think that's all I had. And, Lisa and I are gonna start plotting, putting together, capital improvement plan points
Okay.
and information.
Before I get a nasty letter about my ditch, Tim, the church hasn't been able to get out there on it because of the floods. I said he'll get it this week.
Well, out downtown, it's looking pretty shaggy, but my lawnmower died on me.
Come out and borrow mine.
I think I got mine fixed today.
Okay, I was gonna say, I got your out there, you can put it on. No biggie. Karen did, Karen made it, then I learned how to mow it.
Don't do that.
Farm girl,
I saw her out there.
farm girl, likes to mow.
Mhm.
I mean, I've been told for years and years, stay off my mower.
I'm sure of it.
Before
He
we,
goes out and blows it off with a.
before Mike said something he might regret on Facebook,